Sparta was a name that reverberated through history for generations, with a force that was almost legendary. Men who would sooner die in battle than accept the disgrace of surrender, an entire culture devoted to the art of war, and unstoppable warriors were all evoked by the mere name of this Greek city-state. Sparta had more than just military might. The ancient world was equally enthralled and frightened by this idea, philosophy, and manner of life. However, in a matter of hours, all of this magnificence and military dominance that had been cultivated over generations came to an end. The Spartan myth was destroyed in a single day of combat, exposing the deadly flaws in their ostensibly flawless system. We're discussing the July 371 BC Battle of Leuctra, which revealed the fatal weaknesses that were destroying Sparta from within and permanently altered the balance of power in ancient Greece. We'll explore this remarkable tale in depth today. We will comprehend not just the events that transpired on the battlefield at Leuctra, but also the reasons behind them. We'll look at the sinister and unsettling factors that turned the strongest military force in antiquity into a degraded and broken entity. This is not a single fight tale. It tells the tale of how a whole system, despite its seeming strength, can contain the seeds of its own demise. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and comment on when you saw this video if you like in-depth, thoroughly researched historical stuff. Let's set out on our adventure. We must first comprehend what Sparta was and how it became the center of Greek power in order to fully appreciate the scope of the Spartan disaster at Leuctra. Of all the ancient civilizations, Spartan history is distinct, and its quirks influenced both its triumph and its ultimate demise. It took time for Sparta to become a military power. Certain historical necessities led to its evolution into a very militarized culture. The fertile area of Messenia was subjugated by the Spartan Dorians, who had migrated to the Laconian province of the Peloponnese about the 8th century BC. This was a complete and brutal conquest. Helots, a class of state serfs who cultivated the land for their Spartan lords, were created from the conquered Macedonians. However, this is the core issue that would shape Spartan life for centuries to come. Their Spartan commanders were greatly outnumbered by the Helots. According to some estimations, there were up to 10 helots for each complete Spartan citizen. Imagine a world in which the people you have oppressed outweigh you on a regular basis, those who have a genuine and deep-seated grudge against you. This ongoing fear of a helot uprising served as the catalyst for Sparta's decline into an obsessively militarized culture. This existential menace prompted a dramatic and unparalleled Spartan response. They made a permanent military camp out of their entire community. The AOG, the Spartan school system, was infamously cruel. At the age of 7, boys were separated from their families and forced to undergo a training program that lasted until they became 30. The objective was to create loyal, lethal, and successful troops rather than intelligent people. The use of violence became commonplace. Conformity was imposed using techniques that we would now consider traumatic, and deprivation was viewed as a virtue. Greek warfare was transformed by the Spartan style of fighting. Although the hoplite phalanx was not created by the Spartans, they refined it to the point where it was a war machine that was practically unbeatable. Each fighter protected not just himself, but also the man next to him, making a well-trained phalanx resemble a mobile wall of iron and bronze. This formation was strong because of its discipline, unity, and each man's determination to stand his ground even in the face of overwhelming pressure. The Spartan's secret was hidden here. The Spartans were full-time professional soldiers, in contrast to other Greek city-states who depended on individuals who were primarily farmers, traders, or artisans and only sent in troops when called upon.
The Helots took care of it for them, so they didn't have to work. War was their only occupation. Throughout their adult lives, they trained daily and annually. It was like pros versus amateurs when they fought other Greeks. When the Persian Empire, the most powerful nation on earth, invaded Greece in the early 5th century BC, it was a devastating example of this military dominance. The Spartans ended up representing Greek resistance. It became legendary when King Leonidas and 300 Spartans, together with other Greek allies, managed to hold a narrow pass against a vast Persian force in the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. The battle showed something that frightened both allies and enemies. Even though it was officially a defeat because all of the Spartans were slaughtered, in actuality, the Spartans would rather die to the last man than flee. The terrible Peloponnesian War, which engulfed the Greek world between 431 and 444 BC, further cemented this image for invincibility. Athens and its maritime empire faced forth against Sparta and its Peloponnesian League in this conflict. The conflict between the two systems was a titanic one. Athens stood for intellectual culture, trade, democracy, and naval might. Sparta stood for austerity, military culture, aristocracy, and land power. Greece endured unspeakable hardship during the more than 25-year war. Populations were wiped out, cities were destroyed, and the affluence that had thrived in the century before was mostly lost. However, Sparta ultimately prevailed in 404 BC thanks to Persian financial assistance that enabled them to construct a force to contend with Athenian naval superiority. Athens was driven into a humiliating surrender by the Spartans. A pro-Spartan oligarchic government was established, Athens' fortifications were demolished, and its fleet was turned over. At this point, Sparta was at its most powerful. They were without a doubt Greece's dominant force. Dozens of city-states' policies were influenced by their choices. Their armies were thought to be unbeatable. No Greek army dared to engage them head-on in combat. The Spartans had demonstrated the effectiveness of their system and the results of centuries of militarization and sacrifice. They were Greece's rulers. However, winning the Peloponnesian War signaled the end of Spartan rule rather than the start of a period of enduring dominance, because the same qualities that had made Sparta unbeatable in combat also possessed deadly defects that would start to erode the city-state from within. Among these failures, demographics was the first and possibly the most destructive. In the long term, the Spartan system was unsustainable by nature. You had to be born to Spartan parents, make it through the harsh agog school system, and be allowed to participate in the Syssidia, a communal eating group, in order to be a full Spartan citizen, a Spartiate with full political and military privileges. In order to make this commitment, one had to own enough land to grow the required amount of food. The issue was that for several generations, the number of complete Spartans had been steadily declining. Spartans were killed by ongoing conflict. Because of the harsh school system, not all boys made it to maturity. Due to Spartan inheritance laws that permitted daughters to inherit land, a small number of males accumulated a growing amount of property. Those men who were unable to continue contributing to the Syssidia lost their full citizenship rights and were viewed as inferior. The figures are astounding. Between 8 and 10,000 Spartans are thought to have existed at the height of Spartan power, which occurred in the 5th century BC. However, that number had dropped to about 1,500 by the time of the Battle of Leuctra, which took place less than a century later. That represents a population decline of more than 80%, and this was due to the Spartan system's regular operation rather than some unexpected disaster. Think about this from a military perspective. The depth and density of the Spartan phalanx were its main advantages. Even under severe pressure, a deep phalanx could continue to form after absorbing the force of the first shock.
But the phalanx grew weaker and more exposed as there were fewer and fewer Spartans available to fight. To bolster their numbers, the Spartans started depending more and more on allies and lower-class Spartans. However, these troops were not as well trained, committed, or cohesive as the classic full-blooded Spartans. There was a serious psychological issue as well. You are anxious about losses when there are just 1,500 complete citizens among a population of maybe 100,000, including helots and perioeci. A sizable portion of the populace is represented by each Spartan killed in combat. This starts to influence strategic choices. Once known for their readiness to take significant losses in order to prevail, the Spartans started to second-guess themselves and search for strategies to win with the fewest possible casualties. The second story was fundamental to the Spartan social and educational structure. Although it produced outstanding infantrymen, it also produced military leaders who lacked strategic innovation and were frequently rigid. The AOG placed a strong emphasis on physical bravery, obedience, and conformity. It placed little emphasis on tactical creativity, flexibility, or independent thought. This hadn't been an issue for ages because the Spartan battle strategy, which relied on the hoplite phalanx's superiority in direct combat, worked well against their adversaries. However, the military was evolving. Other Greek commanders were experimenting with new formations, new tactics, and new combinations of soldiers. Due to their adherence to tradition, the Spartans were sluggish to change. A rare exception was Lysander, one of the greatest Spartan commanders who had played a key role in the ultimate triumph over Athens. He was able to think strategically, use deceit and diplomacy, and adapt to changing conditions. However, it was precisely these attributes that made Lysander suspicious in the eyes of orthodox Spartans. He was too daring, too ambitious, and too inclined to defy expectations. Furthermore, there weren't many Spartans of his level to succeed him after his death in battle in 395 BC. The third floor dealt with politics and the hegemonic system that Sparta tried to establish following the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans were horrible at maintaining peace, but they were great at fighting wars. They had an internalized, insular kind of government. They lacked the expertise and motivation to engage in complex diplomacy, form enduring partnerships based on reciprocal advantages, or run an empire in a way that gratified their citizens. Rather, with the help of Spartan military garrisons, the Spartans frequently established pro-Spartan oligarchic governments in the towns under their authority. The local populace frequently disapproved of these regimes and saw them as oppressive. In many cities, including Athens itself, resentment increased. The Spartan-backed oligarchs were overthrown by uprisings, which also brought back more democratic systems of governance. The Spartans used military force, their only familiar tool to respond to these difficulties. However, this led to a vicious cycle. They encountered more opposition the more harshly they ruled. They spread out their meager soldiers more in an attempt to keep control the more opposition they encountered. Additionally, keep in mind that they lacked the Spartans necessary to garrison every city they attempted to seize. Additionally, the reputation of Spartan policies during this time was damaged by morally dubious choices. The Treaty of Antalides in 386 BC is the most well-known example.
In exchange for Persian backing of Spartan control on the Greek mainland, the Spartans effectively gave the Greek cities of Asia Minor back to the Persian Empire. Many Greeks viewed this as treason. After all, the Spartans had been heroes of that struggle when the Persians tried to take over all of Greece only a century before. Now they were giving Greeks to the Persians for political reasons. The moral narrative that had maintained Spartan power was broken by this type of cynical realpolitik. Sparta was no longer viewed as a champion of Greek liberty, but rather as just another tyrannical force out to further its own agenda.
The fourth floor was tactical and military in nature, and it had a direct bearing on what would transpire at Leuctra. The Spartans had become accustomed to their superiority. For generations, their fundamental strategies had remained unchanged. According to Greek custom, they formed their phalanxes with the elite Spartans on the right wing before moving forward. Their greater training, discipline, and bravery typically guaranteed success. This regularity, however, was a drawback. When confronted by the Spartans, any leader knew exactly what to anticipate. Whether they could do anything about it was the question. The answer had been no for a long time. The Spartan execution was just too excellent. However, as their numbers shrank and more non-Spartans joined their ranks, the quality of their execution deteriorated, and generals in other Greek towns began to come up with innovative ways to destroy the Spartan phalanx. This leads us to robbers and Epaminondas, the man who would destroy the myth of Sparta. Located in the Boeotia region north of Athens, Thebes was one of the biggest Greek city-states. Thebes had previously been a minor power. The Thebans' reputation had been damaged for generations by their notorious cooperation with the Persians during the Persian Wars. They had served as Sparta's faithful friends during the Peloponnesian War. However, the relationship between Thebes and Sparta quickly soured following the conflict. In Boeotia, the Thebans had their own goals and desired to establish a Theban-led confederation that would rule over the other cities in the area. This was opposed by the Spartans, who were afraid of any powerful regional force that may threaten their hegemony. The Spartans conducted a daring and contentious coup in 382 BC as tensions increased. The Spartans deceitfully took control of the Theban stronghold of Cadmea during peace talks and established an oligarchic government that supported Sparta. Even by the norms of the time, this was considered ridiculous. Although it was against Greek morality to commit treason during peace talks, the Spartans were becoming more and more determined to keep power by any means necessary. For 3 years, Thebes occupied Sparta. The exiled Theban democrats planned their retaliation at this period. They carried out a bold coup in 379 BC, sneaking into the city, killing the oligarchic rulers, and stirring a populist uprising. After being forced to surrender, the Spartans in Cadmea were given permission to go on certain conditions. However, it was extremely humiliating to lose the city they had so cockily taken over 3 years prior. Now free, Thebes harbored a strong animosity towards Sparta. Additionally, one of the leaders of the freed Thebes was a guy who was not like the majority of Greek military officers in his era. Though not from an affluent household, Epaminondas was the son of an aristocratic Theban family. He had been well educated, having studied philosophy with some of the most influential intellectuals of his era. He was renowned for his intellectual prowess, modesty, and sincerity. Epaminondas, however, was also a military pioneer. After doing extensive research on the art of combat, he came to some startling ideas about how to defeat the Spartan phalanx. Centuries of Greek military doctrine were called into question by his theories. However, Epaminondas possessed the courage of a warrior and the critical thinking of a philosopher. He was going to permanently alter Greek warfare.
In terms of phalanx formation, traditional Greek military doctrine was comparatively consistent. Usually, there were 8 to 12 soldiers in a phalanx. Your finest warriors were assigned to the right wing, which was regarded as the honorific post. The reason behind this was that each fighter protected his left side and the right side of the soldier on his left by holding his shield on his left arm. Each man's right side was therefore slightly uncovered. Because of this, phalanxes had a natural inclination to move to the right during the advance, with each man inadvertently looking for further cover behind his neighbor's shield. Their strong right wing was supposed to try to encircle and defeat the weaker enemy left wing before the enemy did. To their left wing, the right wing may do the same. In essence, it was a race. Because their right flank was made up of great Spartans who were just superior to any opposition, the Spartans typically prevailed in this race. Upon examining this method, I discovered its flaws. He understood that he would never be able to outmaneuver the Spartans at any given time if he distributed his soldiers evenly along the line. What if, however, he did not disperse his forces equally? What if he accepted inadequacies elsewhere and concentrated his strongest forces in one area? Epaminondas had a groundbreaking notion. Instead of the customary 8 to 12 guys, he would construct a phalanx with enormous depth at a certain point that was 50 guys deep or more. The weight and momentum of this deep column would be enormous. He would deploy his strongest men on the left wing, directly across from the Spartan right wing, where the greatest Spartan soldiers would be, rather than on the right wing as was customary. The reasoning was straightforward, but amazing. Indeed, the Spartan left wing would probably overcome his weaker right wing, but he would hold his center and right wing back and refuse the line, as the military refers to it, delaying engagement. Before the remainder of the Spartan line could step in, his incredibly powerful left wing would use sheer force to blast through the Spartan right wing. The remainder of the Spartan army would probably disintegrate if the elite were vanquished. The plan was dangerous. While the left wing advanced, the right wing and center had to be held back with extreme discipline. As they advanced at such depth, the soldiers on the deep left flank had to remain cohesive. And because these soldiers knew they would be up against the greatest of the best Spartans, it took a great deal of guts. However, Epaminondas had the ideal tool to carry out this strategy. The Sacred Battalion was the name of the elite group of warriors that Thebes possessed. There were 300 guys in this unit, divided into 150 pairs. Each partnership had to be made up of male lovers according to tradition. The hypothesis was that men would fight more ferociously with their lovers at their sides in order to defend themselves and avoid appearing cowardly in front of them. The Sacred Battalion was unquestionably a very elite unit, regardless of the reality of their personal relationships. Together, they trained continuously. Their morale and unity were exceptional. They had never lost a war before. The Sacred Battalion would be positioned at the very end of Epaminondas's deep left wing. The anvil of the Spartans would be broken by them like a hammer. But the political climate in Greece deteriorated further before Epaminondas could test his theory against the Spartans. A universal peace amongst the Greek city-states was arranged by the Spartans in 375 BC. The Spartans, however, rejected the offer and removed Thebes from the pact when the Thebans insisted on signing on behalf of the entire Boeotian Confederacy, acknowledging their regional hegemony. In a sense, this was a declaration of war. At the time, Cleobrotus, the Spartan king, was in charge of an army in northern Greece. He was told to enter Boeotia and punish Thebes for its resistance, rather than disbanding it following peace talks. The time had come to remind the Thebans of the true rulers of Greece. Cleombrotus commanded an army of perhaps 10,000 hoplites, comprising 700 Spartans in full, plus second-line soldiers and allies, who marched south against Boeotia. He intended to follow a less traveled path that would lead him into Theban territory close to the city of Leuctra, avoiding the fiercely guarded mountain routes that typically offered access to the area. To fight the Spartans, the Thebans organized their own army under the command of Epaminondas, who had been chosen as one of the Boeotars, or commanders of the confederation. They had a lot fewer hoplites than the Spartans, roughly 6,000. The Thebans should steer clear of a fierce conflict based on standard military reasoning. They ought to withdraw to their fortified cities and impose a protracted siege on the Spartans.
The Spartans would eventually have to leave because their little army was unable to effectively siege a big city like bandits. Epaminondas, however, desired combat. In order to vanquish the Spartans in an open field, he had spent years honing his strategy. He persuaded the troops and his fellow Boeotarchs to confront the Spartans close to Leuctra. It was a big risk. The Theban army might be destroyed, and Thebes would be left helpless against Spartan conquest if Epaminondas was mistaken and his unconventional strategies didn't work. The two armies clashed in the vicinity of Leuctra in July of 371 BC. Because of its relative openness, the battlefield was ideal for the Spartans' chosen style of phalanx engagement. Cleombrotus lined up his soldiers in the conventional fashion. As usual, he positioned the best Spartans on the right wing. Allies and second-line Spartan infantry made up the left and center wings. The conventional depth of his phalanx was around 12 soldiers. Epaminondas carried out his audacious scheme. In a column 50 soldiers thick, or perhaps even more, he concealed his finest Thebans, including the Holy Battalion on the left flank. Refusing the line, he maintained a shallower and more withdrawn center and right wing. Additionally, he placed his cavalry in front of his left flank, outnumbering the Spartan horsemen. It must have puzzled Cleombrotus to see this odd shape. This was the first time a Greek army had engaged in such combat. The rest of the line became dangerously weak as a result of concentrating so much strength in one area. Cleombrotus, however, had faith in his Spartans. They had vanquished every enemy, strategy, and formation they had encountered over many generations. It would be the same with this Theban anomaly. At the front of the conflict, there was a cavalry engagement. Confusion resulted from the Theban cavalry's swift defeat of the Spartan cavalry and their retreat into the Spartan infantry due to its superior quality and training. The clash of the infantry phalanx would decide the actual fight, but this gave the Thebans an early lead. The advance was ordered by Epaminondas. While his center and right wing stayed behind, his deep left wing started to move in the direction of the Spartan right wing. Sensing danger, the Spartans moved forward to confront them. As the best soldiers from both sides surged toward one another, centuries of training, generations of tradition, and a reputation for invincibility all came together. The collision was disastrous. The Spartan line was struck like a hammer by the deep Theban column.
For the first time in their lives, the Spartans faced an adversary as brave and disciplined as they were. Additionally, this adversary had tremendous momentum. Because of the depth of the Theban formation, more Thebans were always pushing from behind, even when the Spartans in front overpowered their opponents. The Spartans fought with their usual ferocious courage. As required by Spartan tradition, Cleombrotus himself was on the front lines. The intense turmoil of close fighting claimed his life. Around him, several of the most powerful and eminent Spartans also fell. However, the Spartans did not instantly disintegrate after the death of their monarch. The Spartan line started to lose way slowly but steadily as they continued to fight and push against the Theban throng. They were being crushed backward by the weight of the Theban column. Men were tramped on and fell underfoot. No matter how much pressure was applied, the configuration that had always remained solid started to break apart. And the Spartan edge vanished as soon as unity was lost. The right wing of Sparta broke. The Spartans fled from an enemy for the first time in decades. The rest of the Spartan line fell into panic. Seeing the Spartan elite retreat ruined their morale, despite the fact that the Spartan center and left wing were performing reasonably well against the weaker sections of the Theban line. The Spartan line fell apart. The conflict was over. They had beaten the Spartans handily. The death toll, however, revealed the full extent of the disaster. 400 of the 700 whole Spartans who had fought were dead. Among the top Spartans themselves, that represents a casualty rate of over 57%.
King Cleombrotus and other high-ranking officers were among the dead. Keep in mind that there were only roughly 1,500 full citizen Spartans at this time. To put this into context, over a fourth of the Spartans' whole population had been wiped out in one afternoon. The best soldiers, those who had survived the agoge and decades of military struggle, were not just any citizens. The effects on the population were disastrous. In addition to actual combat losses, these 400 deaths also symbolized the loss of males who would have fathered the Spartans' future generation. The already severe Spartan population reduction could now be fatal. However, the harm extended well beyond demographics. It had demolished the idea of Spartan invincibility. For years, opponents were demoralized just by the sight of Spartans on the battlefield. Instead than fighting the Spartans, cities chose to surrender. Because they were afraid of the consequences of rebelling, allies stayed faithful. The foundation of all of this was the idea that the Spartans could not be vanquished in combat. Leuctra spectacularly disproved this notion. The Spartans had not only lost, but also been demolished, humiliated, and compelled to leave the battlefield. And not by a huge army from a foreign empire, but rather by a smaller Greek force under the command of a city that until recently had been regarded as a secondary power. Any city might be able to defeat Sparta if Thebes could. Almost immediately, the dread that had kept Spartan hegemony in place vanished. Incredibly quickly, word of the defeat went throughout the Greek world. When messengers brought the awful news to Sparta, the city's renowned iron discipline was displayed by the Spartan officials. When the news arrived, it was a festival, and instead of immediately stopping the public festivities, the authorities discreetly notified the deceased's relatives. When the names were revealed the following day, it was decided that the relatives of the deceased should be happy when they appeared in public, while the families of the survivors were to be sad. The Spartans made an effort to show that they thought it was more honorable to die in battle than to survive defeat, even during times of grieving. However, the truth could not be concealed by any amount of theatrical stoicism.
Sparta was in serious trouble. A quarter of their citizen military had been lost. Their monarch had passed away. They had a ruined reputation. Fear had kept the planned adversaries in check, but now they were seeing that the Spartans were mortal. His triumph was not in vain for Epaminondas. He oversaw several attacks of the Peloponnese, the center of Spartan territory, in the ensuing years. Before Leuctra, this had been beyond the realm of possibility. The Spartan country of Laconia had not been successfully attacked by an enemy in generations. However, Epaminondas led a Theban army directly into Spartan territory in 369 BC, only 2 years after Leuctra. In an open field, the Spartans were unable to muster the strength to confront him. Rather, they sought sanctuary within the city of Sparta itself, which oddly lacked walls. It had always been the Spartans' belief that their warriors were their walls. Such hubris now looked silly, as enemy soldiers were actually within sight of the city. Epaminondas did not try to capture the city. Rather, he took an even more destructive action. Messenia was freed by him. Recall that the key event that initially turned Sparta into a martial culture was the conquering of Messenia and the slavery of its inhabitants as helots. The Spartans were able to serve as full-time soldiers because the Messenian helots supplied the agricultural work. Messenian exploitation was the foundation of the Spartan economy as a whole. In addition to freeing the Messenians, Epaminondas assisted them in constructing Messenia, a new fortified capital city that would act as a barrier against any subsequent Spartan attempts at invasion. Over the years, Messenians who had been exiled due to Spartan oppression were brought back by him. He contributed to the creation of Messenian military and political institutions. He established a strong anti-Spartan Messenian state in a matter of months.
Beyond the military, the loss of Messenia had disastrous consequences for Sparta. Suddenly, the agricultural foundation of Sparta was reduced by roughly half. The Spartans were now forced to either employ workers or till their own land. But in Spartan culture, labor was viewed as a sign of debasement. It was something that individuals of lower status did. Instead of becoming farmers, full-fledged Spartans were expected to be warriors. There was a significant cognitive dissonance. In addition, many Spartans were no longer able to contribute to the syssitia, the communal supper groups, as they needed to in the absence of helot labor. They also lost their position as full citizens since they were unable to make these contributions. Already decimated by Leuctra, the number of Spartans with complete political and military privileges was dropping. In Arcadia, a portion of the Peloponnese that had previously been a Spartan ally, Epaminondas, also contributed to the founding of a new city called Megalopolis. Megalopolis, a sizable fortified city that might serve as an anchor for Arcadian resistance to any Spartan attempt to regain its control, was created expressly to act as a counterbalance to Sparta. He was methodically enclosing Sparta in a network of powerful states, enclosing the once dangerous lion. The total reversal of Spartan fortunes is demonstrated by a unique event that occurred during these operations in the Peloponnese. The Thebans advanced all the way to Sparta's gates. Thousands of helots who were still residing in Spartan territory started to flee to the Thebans. The sight of the Thebans caused dread among Spartan women who had never seen an enemy army. For the first time in history, some Spartans mentioned capitulation. According to reports, a seasoned Spartan officer said sourly that it would have been preferable to have perished at Leuctra rather than to live to witness this day, when the Spartans contemplated capitulation. The fact that surrender was ever mentioned demonstrates how severely the defeat had affected the Spartan mentality, even though the city never really gave up and the Thebans eventually withdrew. However, why didn't the Thebans seize the city when the opportunity presented itself? It was partly for pragmatic reasons. Many Theban lives would have been lost if the city had been taken because Sparta still had strong defenses. However, there was a political component as well. Theban interests could be served by a diminished but surviving Sparta, as Epaminondas, a clever strategist, recognized. A different force like Athens might merge to confront robbers if Sparta were completely destroyed. However, a smaller Sparta would be a helpful counterbalance without actually being a threat. The effects of Leuctra were felt all over the Greek world. Now, cities that had been compelled to submit to Sparta were rebelling. The Peloponnesian League was mostly abandoned by the allies. Following the Peloponnesian conflict, Sparta's imposed political order fell apart. Greece's power structure had dramatically changed. The new Greek hegemonic power was the Thebes, led by Epaminondas and his associate Pelopidas. However, Theban hegemony would not last long. 9 years after Leuctra, Epaminondas was slain in battle in Mantinea in 362 BC. The year before, Pelopidas had him killed. Thebes could not continue to hold its dominant position in the absence of these two sublime characters. The city lacks the resources and depth of leadership necessary to maintain an empire over the long run. Even though the hegemony was short-lived, Sparta suffered irreversible harm. Messenia would never be theirs again. They would never be able to get their citizens back. Their reputation as unbeatable would never return. Although its soldiers were still revered and Sparta remained a city-state, they were now at most a minor or tertiary power. The figures are astounding. About 1,500 people were full-fledged Spartans during Leuctra's time. That figure fell to roughly 700 half a century later. Less than 1,000 Spartans of any kind remained a century after Leuctra. The populace was unable to support itself.
Ironically, the system that was intended to produce the ideal military state ended up producing a state that was doomed due to its demographics. This teaches us a lot about sustainability and the nature of power. At the price of everything else, Sparta had developed a military system that was extremely effective. Their culture was one-dimensional and solely concerned with battle. Their commercial economy was weak. They had no substantial creative or intellectual culture. They had no advanced diplomatic systems. Most deadly of all, they had no viable demographic structure. Great fighters were produced by the agoge, but at what price? How many boys lost their lives in the cruel training? What percentage of survivors suffered psychological harm? Given that their only identity was that of soldiers, how many men decided not to start families? In the short term, the system succeeded in producing military quality, but in the long run, it weakened the very population base that enabled that military quality. Furthermore, fewer and fewer men were eligible to be full citizens due to the severe concentration of wealth in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of Spartans. Large estates were frequently inherited by Spartan women who enjoyed unique property rights in the Greek world. However, many heirs did not share these estates. Instead, they were concentrated. Eventually, only a few dozen rich families owned the majority of Laconia's territory. The core of the Spartan system was also a deep paradox. Despite their ruthless oppression of the Helots, they relied entirely on them for their livelihood. This reliance led to ongoing existential fear. The Spartans were constantly afraid of a Helot uprising. The Cryptaia, a covert police organization made up of young Spartans, was one of their most unsettling customs. They tracked out and killed Helots who were thought to pose a threat. This brutality was a fundamental aspect of the Spartan system, not an exception. It took constant intimidation and violence to keep thousands of people in cruel servitude. However, the Spartans themselves were likewise brutalized by this bloodshed. They were stubborn, neurotic, and vicious as a result.
A culture that was capable of terrorizing a whole population on a regular basis was also one that found it difficult to adjust to changing conditions. The 4th century BC Greek world was not the same as the 5th century Greek world. Emerging were new powers. They were creating new military strategies. There were experiments being conducted with new types of political organization. Because it was stuck in its customs, Sparta was unable to change. Ironically, Sparta's discipline, tradition, and cultural unity, qualities that had made it great, became the same things that made adaptation difficult. The logical Spartan reaction would have been to modify their own strategies after Epaminondas showed that creative tactics could overcome the Spartan phalanx. However, doing so would have meant abandoning customs that were essential to the Spartan identity. Thus, they did not adjust for the most part. They fought like they always did, but with fewer and fewer men. It is also impossible to overlook the moral aspect of this tale. Deep unfairness was the foundation of the Spartan system. The Messenians were enslaved because the Spartans desired their territory, not because they had committed any crimes. The Helots endured under Spartan domination for generations. When Epaminondas released them, he was not only making a geopolitical maneuver, he was making amends for a serious historical wrong. On some level, even the Spartans acknowledged that their status was illegitimate. They were aware that the Helots genuinely detested them. They were aware that the Helots would rebel if given the chance. For this reason, the Spartans were always on guard and preparing for battle. They were aware that the foundation of oppression upon which Spartan civilization was based was immoral. There are undoubtedly elements of Spartan life that are historically fascinating and in some restricted circumstances even praiseworthy. When we view Sparta from a contemporary standpoint, it is easy to be enthralled by its military culture, discipline, and war triumphs.
They were truly heroic in their resistance at Thermopylae. They had remarkable military discipline. We shouldn't romanticize Sparta, yet their women enjoyed liberties that were unusual in the ancient Greek society. Systemic violence served as the foundation for this seriously dysfunctional civilization. It was a police state that was always oppressing its own citizens. It was a culture that prioritized tradition over creativity, toughness over empathy, and uniformity over uniqueness. This system's output was useful for infantry warfare, but it was frequently unprepared for nearly every other situation. There was more to the Spartan devastation at Leuctra than a historical mishap or a case of poor luck. It was an unavoidable result of the Spartan system's basic defects, a system whose demographic base is unsustainable, one that was unable to change with the times, one that used needless violence to alienate conquered communities, one that weakened its own citizens by concentrating wealth in certain ways, was certain to fail at some point. Simply said, Leuctra was the point at which all of these inconsistencies and failures came to a head at once. There weren't enough Spartans because of the demographic catastrophe. They were unable to adequately react to Epaminondas' innovation because of their tactical rigidity. No one hurried to their aid when they were in distress because of the cruelty of their reign. One July day in 371 BC, everything came together on that battlefield. However, the military devastation of Sparta is not the end of the story. In some respects, the fate of Sparta in the centuries and decades following Leuctra is even more tragic and interesting. Sparta was reduced to a ghost of its former self,
a city clinging to the past and frantically attempting to restore a greatness that would never be. Reform initiatives were made. To stop the population loss, rulers like Agis IV and Cleomenes III tried to increase Spartan citizenship and redistribute territory in the 3rd century BC. The interests of the affluent Spartan elite who had monopolized the land were jeopardized by these reforms. Agis's opponents put him to death. Although Cleomenes experienced greater short-term success, outside interference ultimately undid his initiatives. As Rome expanded its dominion over Greece in the 2nd century BC, Sparta effectively turned into a living museum. Roman tourists came to observe the past and other Spartan customs, which were mainly preserved for their amusement. On the shrine of Artemis Ortha, young Spartans were publicly whipped as a show for foreign viewers rather than as a true religious rite, a degrading satire of what Sparta had been. Sparta was permitted to keep its unusual traditions during Roman administration, mostly as a tourist destination. The city had turned into a caricature of itself, entertaining interested tourists with mockeries of its long-standing customs. The Romans, who appreciated some aspects of Spartan culture from a distance, were enthralled by these Spartans performing their ancient customs, not realizing or caring that what they were witnessing was a reconstructed, performative version of what had once been authentic. In a significantly reduced form, the Spartan military tradition persisted. There were Spartan auxiliary units during the Roman Empire, although they were typically mercenaries, just like soldiers from dozens of other areas. The distinctive character, exceptional training, and unity that had made the Spartan soldiers so strong were all gone. What lessons can we draw from Sparta's growth and fall? First, long-term security can never be ensured by military might alone. For many generations, Sparta had the best army in the Greek world, but its foundations were unsustainable. Even the most potent military machinery will eventually fall short in the absence of a strong economy, an expanding population, or the capacity for innovation and adaptation. Second, oppressive and unfair systems bear the seeds of their own demise. Spartan culture as a whole was shaped by the existential threat posed by the decision to enslave the Messenians. The Spartans turned their entire civilization into a military camp because they were always afraid of rebellion.
However, this over-militarization led to further issues that ultimately proved lethal. Perhaps they could have created something more sustainable if they had discovered a more just method of structuring their society that did not include the violent subjugation of a sizable populace. Third, conservatism and tradition have their place, but they must be weighed against the flexibility to adjust to changing conditions. In many situations, the Spartans' respect for customs and traditional methods worked to their advantage. It brought unity and stability. However, the Spartans found it difficult to adjust when the world changed and new problems emerged that needed new answers. Their strength turned into a vulnerability. Fourth, while quality is vital, numbers are also important. Although they were limited in number, the Spartans had the best individual troops. The math worked against them when they confronted an enemy with numerical advantage at that moment, and the ability to equal their quality at the point of decision, as Epaminondas did at Leuctra. The mathematical realities of collective fighting were too strong for any amount of individual bravery to overcome. Fifth, even in ostensibly conservative professions like military, creativity and innovation are extremely valuable. Despite having a smaller force than the Spartans, Epaminondas had a superior plan. Greek combat was rewritten by his tactical invention, the deep column that was aimed directly at the enemy's strongest point. He approached the problem in a novel way and came up with a solution that had never been tried before. Lastly, leadership is really important. History can be altered by individuals. Leucotron probably wouldn't have occurred if it weren't for Epaminondas. Unlike other cities, the Thebans would not have engaged in direct combat with the Spartans. However, Epaminondas has the foresight, bravery, and expertise to carry out a completely novel idea, and he revolutionized the globe in the process. One of the most significant turning events in military history is still the fight of Leuctra. It is comparable to later conflicts like Stalingrad or Waterloo in terms of its influence on power dynamics. An entire civilization's power dynamics were drastically altered by a single day of fighting. Beyond its political and military significance, however, Leuctra provides us with a glimpse into the more profound aspects of human history. It demonstrates how civilizations change over time, how systems have inherent paradoxes, and how even the strongest institutions can fail if their underlying assumptions are incorrect. For many generations, Sparta appeared unbeatable, but it was corrupted from the inside out and eventually encountered an adversary who could take advantage of these flaws. We are also reminded of the human costs of tyrannical systems by Spartan history. The Helots endured generations of suffering under Spartan control, the Agagos' brutalization of the Spartan lads, the soldiers who lost their lives at Leuctra on both sides. All of these individuals were actual people whose lives were influenced by and frequently ruined by the decisions made by their societies. Centuries later, discussing Sparta in abstract terms such as warrior society or military might is simple. But we must keep in mind that we are talking about a system that over ages caused great pain to thousands of individuals. But there's a reason why Sparta is still so fascinating. Their incredible exploits in battle, their exceptional dedication, and their readiness to sacrifice all for military success are all noteworthy. The Spartans established a whole community based on a single idea, which is unprecedented in human history. This experiment is still fascinating to analyze, even though it ultimately failed. Furthermore, Leuctra continues to serve as a reminder that nothing in the past is permanent. Empires come and go. Even seemingly permanent systems can break down in a day. Centuries-old reputations can be ruined in a matter of hours. Being invincible is never real. No matter how strong you appear to be, you will always have flaws and paradoxes. There's always a chance that someone more intelligent, creative, or lucky will figure out a method to beat you. It must have been horrible for the Spartans who survived Leuctra, who had to return home to a civilization in shock and grief, and who had to live with the knowledge that the myth had been destroyed.
Being invincible was important to their identities. If the Spartans were defeatable, what did it mean to be Spartan? How can you come to terms with the realization that the system that defined your entire life and into which you were indoctrinated since infancy has failed? Most likely, some Spartans blamed ill luck of specific commanders. It's likely that some people still held on to the idea that Laura was an anomaly and that Spartan principles were superior. However, the more astute must have recognized that something more basic was amiss, that the system as a whole had defects that no amount of personal bravery could fix. It's possible that some people secretly felt relieved that the weight of being unbeatable had been removed. They were relieved that they were not held to an unattainable standard anymore. Relief at being able to be vulnerable, flawed, and human like everyone else. However, since acknowledging such sentiments would have been viewed as a betrayal of everything Sparta stood for, these ideas would have to stay hidden. There is more to Leuctra's story than military strategy or the distribution of political power. It concerns the characteristics of excellence and its boundaries. It's about the price of success and the cost of failure. It concerns the decisions that define and occasionally condemn societies. It's about a time when mythology gives way to reality, forcing everyone to face hard realities. Perhaps humility is the lesson here. The Spartans had grown conceited about their superiority. Their belief in their own mythology had grown. Leuctra was a severe correction to that arrogance. She reminded them of their mortality, the flaws in their system, and the temporary nature of their dominion. This lesson has insight that goes beyond the particular period and setting of ancient priests. Every country, organization, and individual in a position of authority must keep in mind that there is always someone out there trying to beat you, that victory is never assured, and that domination is never permanent. Nobody can afford the luxury of complacency. No matter how great they seem on the surface, systems built on flawed foundations will inevitably fail, and adaptation is not an option. Today, we frequently think of Sparta in terms of its famed soldiers, distinctive military culture, and triumphs at Thermopylae. Furthermore, there are good reasons to research and even appreciate some facets of Spartan accomplishment. The military efficiency of what they produced was simply remarkable. But we also need to keep Leuctra in mind. We have to recall the day that everything broke down. The 400 Spartans who were slain on that field must be remembered. Each signifies the irreversible downfall of an entire civilization rather than merely a military loss. We must never forget the thousands of helots who were released when Messenia was freed by the ancient Greeks. We have to keep in mind Epaminondas and his inventive strategies, which demonstrate that, with enough imagination, even the most formidable foe may be vanquished. Furthermore, we must learn from this history about sustainability, justice, adaptation, the limitations of military might, the costs of oppressive systems, the value of innovation, the place of the individual in history, and the fallibility of even the most powerful. Even though Leuctra's narrative ended more over 3,200 years ago, its teachings are still applicable today. We observe seemingly invincible countries and organizations in our own time, orthodoxies that appear unquestionable, systems that appear everlasting. Sparta serves as a reminder that nothing is certain. No matter how magnificent the structure erected atop it, weak foundations will eventually collapse. Change is always conceivable, and the unexpected can happen. Therefore, when you think about Sparta, bring to mind both the myth of unbeatable warriors and the fact that the city can be destroyed in a single day. Perhaps take some lessons from this for the present and the future. Keep in mind that huge empires may fall, reputations can be destroyed, and certainties can be shaken. The mysterious cause of Sparta's destruction in a single day was neither misfortune, treachery, nor a lack of bravery. It was the unavoidable outcome of a system that had been doomed from the start to fail. Leuctra was just the day those seeds broke through and devoured the once powerful tree. This is the tale of Sparta's downfall and the Battle of Leuctra. It's a story of war, of course, but a lot more. It concerns the decisions societies make and the results of those decisions. It's about the boundaries of strength and the cost of power. It's about the fact that even the strongest people are ultimately mortal and human. I give thanks to the Lord God for enabling us to study and gain knowledge from history by gaining insight from the experiences of our predecessors. May we apply this understanding to create societies that are more equitable, sustainable, and compassionate. May we be guided by divine providence to steer clear of past mistakes and create better futures. Glory and praise be to the Creator who gave us the capacity to learn, think, and develop through the study of human history.